Inviting me. I'm very excited to speak at the conference. I've heard many good things about it over the years, so I'm happy to finally be able to participate in it. So today, as Lola mentioned, one of my interests is crowdsourcing, and I thought it might be of interest to you too. How many of you are actually translators? Okay, I wasn't sure because a lot of the talks have been on interpreting and many of you were participating, so I thought, oh my gosh, maybe there's a whole group of interpreters and they're not really interested in crowdsourced translation at all. So what I wanted to do was to talk about some of the sort of the pros and the cons on both the professional side and to offer you a little bit of the research to maybe give some weight to one side or the other. But judging from what I heard during the ethics debate, I think I already know where most of you lie in this debate, but I'm hoping that maybe I can offer some arguments both ways, so you could possibly think that crowdsourcing isn't necessarily as terrible to the profession as some people have suggested. And I thought I might begin by asking you what you think crowdsourcing is before I get into some definitions that I had. Has anyone heard of crowdsourcing, or if you have heard of it, what is it that you think of when you think of the term? Any hands? Yeah.
Basically, lay people translating, users of a service, translating into different international versions.
Yeah, so that's definitely, actually I'll go with the definition that I prefer, but it's definitely along those lines, where you open up translation to the general public. And this is as I said, there's a number of different definitions, but this is the one that I like, and I like it for a number of reasons. One is because it doesn't specify that the people who are doing the translation are necessarily not professional translators. It's important to keep in mind that when you open it up to lay people, or when you open translation up to the general public or to your users if you're a company, that a lot of the people who are going to participate in the project might have no professional experience in translation whatsoever, but sometimes professional translators participate in these kinds of activities as well. And I'll show you some examples of how professionals participate. I also like the fact that this definition doesn't mention that crowdsourcers are not necessarily financially remunerated for their work. And one of the reasons why I like that is because some of the models will actually try to provide financial compensation for the participants, but what they usually do, in contrast to traditional translation, where usually you're paid a fairly generous amount per word or an hourly rate. Here we would be looking at things like micropayments. So you might be paid, say, a few cents to translate a sentence, and then someone else might be paid a few cents to rank five translations. And someone else might be paid a few cents to revise the translations or to pick their favorite out of the list. So it does sometimes involve micropayments, but a lot of the times it doesn't involve any sort of financial compensation. And I'll look at other ways that participants are compensated in that case. So as I said, Mindy Cohagen offered this definition. She talks about it being undertaken by unspecified self-selected individuals, meaning that when a company launches a crowdsourced translation initiative, they put out basically an open call on their website saying, if you're interested in participating, why not translate a sentence here, a sentence there, whenever you have a chance, and people are then able to choose and translate whatever interests them, in what language pairs they're interested in, given their background, whether they have, if they feel they have particular strengths in a given language pair, or if they have particular strengths in a given field of study, or if something just appeals to them in general. And in digital media spaces, meaning that these projects generally take place online. You don't find crowdsourced translation happening offline. We're usually talking about translating websites, but we could also be talking about other types of projects, and I'll give you some examples of those in a minute. One of the challenges to talking about crowdsourcing is that it also goes by a lot of other names. So you hear people talking about open translation, social translation, user-generated translation, community translation, collaborative translation, wiki translation, and sometimes people use all of these terms all together as well. But usually they're all talking about the same sort of thing, putting out a general call to the public rather than to a group of professional translators to have them volunteer to translate content. As I said, though, sometimes there are micropayments involved. I wanted to mention the fact that crowdsourcing can also take different forms. So these models, I didn't propose them myself. I took them from a report that was published in 2011. And they talked about 3 different models. So the first one that they wanted to talk about was product-driven models. And these usually involve a piece of open source, free or open source software projects. So things like Omega T or OpenOffice. And what happens here is that volunteers are participating to help create the software, and so volunteers then help participate to translate the software. So it's not one person localizing the entire piece of software, but it could be 1,000 volunteers, each contributing bits and pieces of it. They could also be translating the documentation, things to do with the websites, but it all focuses on a particular product. Cause-driven initiatives are initiatives that focus around an organization that has a not-for-profit mission. So you might find something like Wikipedia, which wants to create a free encyclopedia, the largest encyclopedia in history, and it's a not-for-profit initiative. The editors who participate in writing Wikipedia articles are not paid, and the people who volunteer to translate the Wikipedia articles are also not paid. Things like Global Voices Online, which is a community of more than 1,000 bloggers and translators from around the world who work to bring reports from blogs and citizen media, and so they try to translate blog entries as well. Again, the bloggers aren't paid, and neither are the translators. And in these kinds of projects, one particular translator might translate 250 words or 500 words at a time, and somebody else might translate something else. So it's a large initiative where not one person is translating all of the blog entries. Usually people are picking and choosing projects that interest them. Or something like the TED Open Translation Project. I'm sure most of you have heard of the TED Talks. Okay, well, there are again, it's another not-for-profit mission to help spread ideas and to spread knowledge. These are talks by often very high-profile individuals, but often just people with incredibly interesting ideas, and they'll be talking for they're fairly short. Some of the talks are about 10 minutes long. The speakers aren't paid, but they're trying to disseminate knowledge, trying to mobilize people around different kinds of ideas. And the reason why this ends up as a crowdsourcing model is because TED opened up their subtitling to the general public. They asked if anybody was interested in subtitling these TED Talks, which are available in English, into any language that they like. TED will provide a transcript of the talk, and then they have volunteers translating the talks. And they will have a second volunteer looking at the translation, and then they have the subtitles that will be added to the videos. And so when you're watching the videos, you're able to actually choose from a drop-down menu of different subtitles and have the subtitles appear on the videos. So those two first types of models, they don't usually generate too much contention around with professional translators. The last model is the one that often irks professional translators. And this is the case where a for-profit company decides that what they want to do is, instead of hiring a professional translation team, instead of turning to a translation agency, they're going to turn to the general public, generally to their users, to have them translate generally their website interface. So things like Facebook and Twitter, where they will basically turn to their users and say, you've helped make our product what it is, therefore you should help participate in making our product available in Spanish or German or French or whatever other language they would like to make it available in. They turn to the users. They'll often create an interface to go along with it, and there are still different models that are followed even when we're looking at an outsourcing-driven project as opposed to the cause-driven or the project-driven. So I'll show you some of the different things that distinguish the models. On the one hand, in some cases you have a number of barriers to entry. So even though it's open to the general public, it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody can participate equally. There are sometimes barriers. I'll show you some of those in a minute. Some of the models involve revision by professionals. Some of them involve no revision, and some of them involve revision by the participants. And usually various incentives are offered to the participants. As I mentioned, generally the participants are not financially remunerated, or if they are, they're offered very small micropayments that wouldn't allow them to make a living from this. But they are offered a number of other incentives, and some of these incentives, I think, could provide a model for the professional translation industry to actually build on. So barriers to entry, I split these up into linguistic barriers and technical barriers, and I have some examples on both sides of the fence. So this is an excerpt from TranslateWiki, which is a crowdsourced initiative. And on the one hand, they have no linguistic barriers whatsoever. They have a paragraph that says, by saying anybody can translate it, we really mean it. We've split everything up into 2 sentences, or into very small chunks. The phrases are grouped together, they're short, they're easy to understand, so even if you don't master a language enough to use it, you can get the meaning of the phrases, and therefore you can translate. So as I said, this is on the one extreme, where basically they're saying, if you understand a language even to any tiny degree, you can translate into the other language. On the other hand, you have something like Twitter. Again, they haven't made this mandatory, but if you go to the translation center and you look, well, if you look close to the end over there, you'll see that they have a Learn option in their menu. When you click on the Learn option, they have a number of different translation lessons. They can help you familiarize yourself with the glossary, with the code, with the vocabulary and style, and they even have a section on translation techniques. The catch is that these aren't mandatory. If I wanted to go into Twitter Translation Center and I wanted to translate, I can start without actually having to go through any of this training. I assume the rationale for that was that if we make this seem too much like job training, people are probably not going to be interested in participating. What we really want to do is make it as easy as possible for people to participate. But at the same time, they do have some sort of tutorial set up to help people realize that translating is not just a matter of you type out whatever you want and it's going to be anything goes. There are some glossary terms that are actually set up. So they'll have a little quiz that says these are the following terms that we've accepted, and then over here in the quiz they say which is the correct translation for this term, which they just told you in the paragraph before, and you can flip through and finish the quiz. Technical barriers to entry. One of the things that happens with the very large projects like Twitter and Facebook is that the organizations that launch the Crowdsourcing initiative are very interested in breaking down the technical barriers. Because again, if you put up too many barriers to having people participate, you're not going to be able to entice your users to help you translate these projects. So something like the Twitter Translation Center, you're able to go, when you first log in on the right-hand side over here, it shows you a list of what projects are still being undertaken. So they'll say, we're still looking for translations for this particular interface, for this particular section of the website, whereas these sections are already translated 100%. We don't need any more participants over there. And once you've gone to a section that still requires translation, you can see over there they have little arrows. You're able to flip through to the passages that are still being finalized. You're able to look through the contributions. You can vote on them just by clicking on the vote option. There is the blue hyperlink over there says edit translation. So if you want to go in and edit somebody else's translation, it's as easy as just clicking on the edit and making a correction. And you can actually go through and view all the translations that are available for a particular sentence. In some cases, these will range from very small things. You can see something like reset password, or there's a problem logging into your account. In other cases, they had a 500-word segment that they were looking for a translation of. And there were, I think, at least 100 different contributions to it that people were able to vote on and edit as well. So the idea is that the more votes a translation gets, the higher it moves up in the ranking, and that eventually, the idea is something that has the most votes would obviously be the most acceptable and the most problem-free, and that would be the translation that would be adopted. Okay, so this is, on the one hand, very few technical barriers to entry. On the other extreme, this is from the Open Office localization page. So you can see that in this case, they haven't actually broken down very many technical barriers. If you want to join and become a volunteer, you sign up for their mailing list. You get your language in the form of a tar.biz2 archive. You need to uncompress the archive. You use a special software 7-zip to do it, so you're going to have to download that. It has 276 files in a number of directories. You need to work on only those that have changed. You need to open all of them, edit it with PO Edit, which you can also download. And then once you're able to do that, you can mark your changes fuzzy using the cloud symbol, and then you can exchange it with them again. So all of that requires a lot of technical know-how. There's a lot of people who wouldn't be familiar with some of the requirements, and in addition, it requires a number of steps. You're going to be downloading software, you're going to be installing it on your hard drive, which you didn't have to do with something like the Twitter Translation Center. It's just a matter of going to the Translation Center with your Twitter account and saying, I would like to participate, you choose your language, and off you go. In terms of revision, in some cases the projects will have review by other participants. Sometimes these participants will be senior participants. In the case of TED, for instance, before a subtitle is actually matched up with the video, it has to be reviewed by a second volunteer. But there's no requirement that the second volunteer has to have any special training in translation. It's just a matter of a second person giving their opinion on it. In the case of Facebook, there is actually review by language professionals at the very end. So once a translation has been voted, there are some professional translators who've been hired to do some review at the back end, really. So they're not the visible translators, but they are working in the background. In other cases, for some projects, it's a little bit difficult to tell whether it's professional translators who are doing the reviewing or just other participants. I've looked at some of the calls, for instance, from Twitter on a Yahoo mailing group, and it looked as though they were looking for volunteer moderators who wouldn't actually necessarily have to have any professional translation training, but they would be the ones deciding on some of the final translation solutions. In terms of the incentives, as I mentioned, not a lot of financial incentive, but they do offer a number of other interesting incentives. TED, for instance, provides credit for work. Actually, most of them will provide very visible credit for the translators. So if you look, for instance, on the first screenshot that I have over there, that's for the TED Talks. For every talk that's been subtitled, you see that they have the red name at the top is the translator, and the red name underneath that is the reviewer. And if you click on the red link, you'll be taken to that translator and that reviewer's page where they can have a photo of themselves, they can list their experience and their training or their interests, basically whatever they would like to put on their profile page. And as I said, this happens for every talk. So for every translation that you've done, you get full credit for it, which often doesn't happen in professional circles. You'll see global voices as well. I've taken a shot over from there. That's the first person is the person who wrote the article, and the second person is the person who translated the article. And again, there's a hyperlink that goes back to that person's profile page where they can add a photo of themselves and as much information as they would like to add. Other incentives, this is from a project called WebFlakes, and this is actually fairly common to a lot of the projects like Twitter and Hootsuite. They'll provide things like badges. So after you've translated X number of words, you'll get a badge that says you're level 1 translator because you've translated so many words. You might also get a badge that says I'm a great French translator because I focused on the French section, or I've improved so many French translations, things like that. So the badges are those little circles down at the bottom. They've also listed, for instance, how many translations they've done, and they have things like shout-outs. So again, it depends on the project. A shout-out could be something as simple as, if you're in Facebook, it could be how many likes you got for your translations. If you're in Twitter, it could be how many votes you got for your translations. In this case, it's how many shout-outs, so how many approvals you got from other members of the community for your translations. WebFlix also offers an interesting incentive that I haven't seen anywhere else. They will make a donation to charity for every I believe it's every 500 words that you produce, they will donate $1 to a charity, and 70 cents of that money will go to the charity of the translator's choice, and 30 cents of that will go to the charity of the reviewer's choice. I believe it's something like that. Sorry, I lost my note for that, but I know that they do donate $1 to charity for every 500 words. So you'll see underneath the profile, they said that X number of, $1,149 has been donated to a charity called Water, and of that, $81 was raised by this particular person. So on their profile page, it does show you how much money they've generated for the charity as well. So that's another incentive that does happen, but it's something that I think is particular to WebFlakes. I haven't seen other organizations making donations to charity based on the work that you've been doing. Other incentives that come up fairly frequently are things like leaderboards. So if you go to the homepage of the translation project, you might see the list of top contributors, which again will often take you to a link on their profile page, telling you that they've translated X number of words, or they've participated in X number of projects. So you might be wondering, why are organizations interested in crowdsourcing? Why are they asking people to translate their websites or to participate in their initiatives when these people don't really have any, often don't have any training in translation, and you don't really have any way of vetting their work if you're just going to let the reviewers, or sorry, the participants review one another's work. I have some quotes here, but before I get to them, I thought I might ask you what you think. Why do you think companies would be interested in the crowdsourcing model? Yeah?
Money for money to save money.
Okay, so this is definitely something that comes up from professional translators, and I'll talk about this in a minute. So the main argument from professional translators is crowdsourcers are trying to save money. They are trying to get something for free, and what they're really compromising on is quality. It of course doesn't come up when you look at quotes from the companies that engage in crowdsourcing, they don't mention the money. Now this could be because they don't want to talk about the fact that they might be exploiting workers, but the other argument is that it does cost a lot of money to create an interface. If you look at, for instance, Twitter's interface, to create an interface whereby the public can actively participate in translating. And instead of investing the money in a translation organization, you're investing the money in the IT development to create the platform. Their argument is often, our users are really engaged with the product, we want to find a new way to help them stay engaged. So for instance, if you look at this quote here, this is from Ethan Zuckerman, Global Voices Online. So this is a cause-driven initiative, it's a not-for-profit initiative. He says, the texts are translated by volunteers, the translations are extremely high quality because they're done by people who really care about the content. He also said that when he talked about this with the organizers of the TED conference, they were so impressed with what had happened at Global Voices Online that they decided to use the crowdsourcing model themselves. And initially what they did was they didn't want to launch the project and have no translations available. They didn't want to just say we're interested in translations, but we don't have anything. So they hired some professional translators to subtitle a number of talks, so that when they first launched the project, they would already have some talks subtitled. And what they said was that when they compared the volunteer translations with the professional translations, they liked the volunteer translations better, even though the volunteers weren't necessarily professionals. This comes up over and over again. This is another quote from Baldur's Gate. So this is not a not-for-profit piece of software. It's a video game that was a for-profit video game, but it was localized into. Actually, sorry, I don't know what language it was localized into, but it was a crowdsourced fan translation. And in an interview, he gave his impression about it. He said, these are passionate fans, they know the ins and outs, they know the little details, and they're doing it because they love it. And the quality is so much higher. So as I said, this comes up over and over again. The fans know it, therefore it's got to be better than the professional translators. Even though you could certainly find a professional translator who's familiar with the video game and would therefore know it and have the professional training. But that never comes up in the quotes that you get from the crowdsourcers. I have another one over here from the engineering manager of Twitter. The volunteers are avid Twitter users. They understand the product before they translate the string. They tend to come up with good translations. Turnaround time is good. When we introduce a new feature, the volunteers respond quickly. And then he also argued that it was easier to support more languages when you can rely on volunteers, because you don't necessarily have to find a professional translator who can translate into Swahili. You can just open it up to your Swahili users and have them translate it for you. So clearly, I can see from your reactions, you're not going to have the same views as the crowdsourcers. I do have some quotes here from professional translators on both the pro and the con side, but I thought before I showed them to you, we could initiate a little bit of a discussion. So yes?
Are the only companies who are doing it sort of saying the social networking and the social networking company, or would IBM, does IBM do it, or does General Motors do it?
Well, certainly the most common examples that you find are the social networking sites, but as I said, I did show you an example from the fan translation of Baldur's Gate as well, which is a video game, so it does get done outside of the social networking realm. What often happens is that it tends to be those social networking sites because you need a really engaged community of users who are going to be passionate enough about the product that they're going to be interested in translating it. If you don't have a connection between the company and the users, you're not going to find as many volunteers who are going to be interested.
I don't understand, because the fact that translation is not such an easy job. Why does anybody want to do it for free? I don't know if there's nothing else to do. And how do you know that it's free? Because people at Twitter don't necessarily speak Spanish, or French, or whatever it is. So how do they know?
And that's a really interesting question. This comes up all the time. On the professional side, and I'll show you some of the reactions. Actually, sorry, these are the pro reactions, so I'll show those in just a minute. You'll often have people questioning, how can you possibly ensure quality when you're dealing with a number of people who don't know anything about translating, or who don't necessarily know anything about translating? The argument from the crowdsourcers, or from the companies that organize the crowdsourcing campaigns, is with this number of people, eventually somebody is going to catch a mistake, even though they don't necessarily have any training in translation. So if you have 1,000 people who are all looking at the same sentence and voting on it, eventually they're going to throw out the garbage translations, and all you're going to be left with is the good stuff. Oh, I see lots of hands. Okay, and then we know.
That's the same argument as saying, let's put a disease or a problem online, and let's have anybody diagnose it. You don't have to be a doctor, and we'll pick the best diagnosis. That's ridiculous. That's popularity. That's not based on any knowledge. It's not based on any intellectual effort. That's really exploiting. And I don't think anybody would accept people doing diagnosis of a disease online, and yet because language is considered that everybody knows it, we accept that. And I just cannot, I don't really accept that it's a positive thing. It doesn't help the profession. It doesn't help to promote knowledge and language. Anyway.
Yeah.
Not only that it doesn't promote, but actually it is destroying the profession. And I think that they are just praising volunteers just to justify that they are getting the job done free of charge. So that is outrageous. I'm really consternated by that kind of preference of volunteer translation rather than to use a professional translator.
Okay. And actually, so I should ask the question, does it bother you as much when it's a not-for-profit initiative as it does when it's a for-profit initiative?
Yes.
I think that the arguments that you have quoted there, I know it's not your opinion, I hope, it's just a combination of greed and ignorance. Ignorance of how professional translation is done, and greed because, for example, you mentioned Twitter as one of the culprits, and the Twitter IPO recently was so successful that their stock went up 10%, or 10 times actually, tenfold. So they can definitely afford to hire professional translators. I second the example, and I'll give another one. I'm very passionate, I mentioned the passion. I'm very passionate about music. I love music. Okay, but that doesn't make me a musician. I couldn't sing to save my life, just as much as I like music. So it's the same with translation or with any other profession.
Yeah.
I argue, for example, you said Facebook, they have against certain, professional translators who check and revise again. But this one, it's like open source program. Like Microsoft, they are a franchise and they sell their products. And then open source programmers from different parts of the world, they take part in writing another software. And it's free of charge for the public. But it's again a program. It's not like a disease. If you cannot diagnose, that's medicine is a different thing. But if there is something like certain text that it's for, they put it online and everybody comes and, step up to the plate or whatever you say, and it generates a lot of, views and ideas, and it's like brainstorming. We can't say that volunteers always they are bad. You can find sometimes that there is a good translator somewhere in the world and they can contribute very well. But as long as there is another reviser behind the scene and they check and they say, okay, I agree, I don't disagree with this case. That's online you can do. And I have seen some in my own language, Farsi Dari, online there are good translations over there.
Okay. I think I'll go with the pros and the cons. I don't have a lot more time left, but I still had a lot more points I wanted to cover. There have been some professional translators who have weighed in on this and who have looked at translation as a possibly positive model, or that some aspects of it are positive. Naomi Bayer, for instance, suggests that it's a good way to have collaboration between professionals and amateurs. So for instance, if you look at the Facebook model where you do have professional translators reviewing the translations, you can have the non-professionals contributing, and it could possibly be a training ground for novices. So people who don't have a lot of experience in translation and who would be unable to define work, typically, because often what happens is that before a company wants to hire you, they often want you to have a few years of experience under your belt. Well, it is a way for novices to get some experience, and possibly for the professionals and the amateurs to collaborate together. There is an argument that it provides greater visibility for translation and for translators, because the argument has been that it alerts the general public that there is a need for translation, whereas the general public might not have been aware of it in the first place. I'll show you some reasons why I don't think that's necessarily the case. And Guillaume, who wrote in a recent issue of Language Update, said that he thought it was great because you could have collaboration and you didn't have to have this hierarchy of a reviser tells you it's wrong because the reviser is more experienced than you. You're all on the same level, so you have collaboration between peers. He also said it was greater freedom for translators. You get to pick the text that you want to translate instead of having to translate something because that's what you've been given by your client today, and it might not be something that interests you. On the other hand, there were a lot of cons, and a lot of these have come up in our discussion as well. Exploitation of the internet, you're basically exploiting users. You're getting unpaid labor from them because it's so easy to via the internet. Guillaume also said that although he liked the fact that there was greater freedom for translators, he said the translation interfaces, they're nothing like what you typically use as a translator. So if you're a professional translator, it makes it very tedious sometimes to translate. He was talking in particular about Wikipedia. And of course the argument comes up all the time, companies are trying to save money. Although, as I've said, the counter-argument for that is that the companies are investing a lot in the interface development, and so sometimes they haven't actually saved any money by the time the process is over. The other argument is that you're only going to get low-quality translation because you're relying on amateurs. But I should point out as well that sometimes professional translators do participate in the initiative, so you could make the argument that if the professional translators are involved, maybe there might be some better quality. I'll show you a little bit of the research. I haven't told you.
Julie, you started 10 minutes later, so we are going
okay.
to adjust those 10
Okay,
minutes.
so that's
Take your
great.
time.
We'll talk a little bit more. So I'll talk about the 3 main points of contention, and then I will get to a little bit of the research. There isn't a lot of research that's been done on the translation quality, but I do have a couple of examples of research that's been done. Yeah?
Hi, has there been any studies to know actually how many that are crowdsourcing are actually trained translators as opposed to?
I have one example that I can show you. It's only for Wikipedia, but it is one example. It was some research that I did, but I haven't seen any other research that showed us what the ratio is of non-professionals to professionals. So as I said, I think the three of the main points of contention are this issue of remuneration. Why aren't we paying the translators if what we're doing is something that is a professional activity, or at the very least a very skilled activity that requires a lot of special training? What about this issue of visibility? Are we really increasing visibility for the profession, and is it good visibility versus bad visibility? And what about this issue of quality? Are we getting good quality as the crowdsourcers are arguing? They're arguing that they're getting better quality because people are interested in translations, and they're going to do a bang-up job because they're so into the project, as opposed to somebody who's just doing it for something as base as money. So remuneration, I think this is a really interesting issue, because if you look at these appeals that companies will make to their users, and I focused only on the outsourcing-driven projects, so these for-profit projects, because I think these are definitely the most contentious. You'll see that what they often do is they try to rely on people's feeling that they're committed to this project somehow. We're trying to unite our users. Just a few hundred of you can help make thousands of international fans of this software happy. This is from Hootsuite. Facebook, that you want to join our community of translators. We want to make Facebook available to everyone, everywhere, with the implication that it's only available in English. There's some people who are missing out, and you're really contributing to them missing out if you don't help participate in the project. Twitter says you've helped define what's important about the product, so you should define your local experience too. We don't want to turn it over to translators because they're not Twitter users. That's the assumption. What we really want to do is turn it over to Twitter users because they must have the language skills that they need. So you could argue that nobody would participate if they felt they're being exploited, but I think this is a really tricky way of trying to market these projects. We're looking at a for-profit company, but sometimes people forget that these are for-profit companies. Facebook offers its services for free, Twitter offers its services for free, and people think, oh, I've been given all these free services, I should help give back to the community. Even though what we really have here is a for-profit company that is relying on unpaid labor, unpaid professional labor to get its translation services done. Yeah?
Question, how could this be considered experience if it's not, you're not even really, no one's really judging the quality of the work, and if they are, who's actually judging the work? Because you mentioned that why do people do it? To get experience, but what kind of experience, if someone would consider this experience if you want to go work for a real translation company?
Well, what often happens is that because your translations are always linked to your username, you would be able to then turn to someone and say, these are the translations that I've done. You can judge for yourself whether they are of good quality. At any point, someone can go back and click on your username and see the translations that you've offered. And so the argument here on the visibility is if you're trying to make yourself more visible as a translator, break out into the field, you'd be able to say, take a look at my work. The work should speak for itself, basically. Because you're right, you don't have the professional stamp on it to say, yes, it's been accepted by a professional translator, but you could make the argument that if the work is good enough on its own, when you show it to somebody else, they're going to agree that it was good work and it was part of an actual project rather than a make-work project in a school classroom. Yeah?
Well, from what I understand, notwithstanding this voting process, it goes through a number of revisions. It goes through so many revisions by so many people, but in the end, how do you know what you translated? It's not your translation anyway. Well, how can you say, look at the translation I did? It's got your name on it, but it's not yours.
Again, it depends on some of the projects. Some of them, there isn't as much. For Twitter and Facebook, you do see a lot of the voting, and they do get edited. In some other projects, there isn't as much manipulation between when the translator submits it and then when it finally appears on the website. But you're right, there is that problem too, that there are so many people involved sometimes in the translation. If you think, for instance, of something like Wikipedia, so many people can go and edit your translation, that's very hard for you to say even a week later that maybe it was your own translation, although you could look through the history, but some of them are so time consuming that's very unlikely a client is going to say, well, okay, let me just spend a couple hours looking through this, I'll weed out which ones were yours, and I'll then be able to judge your work. So the other contentious issue is this idea of translator and translation visibility. As I said, the argument has often been it increases the visibility for translation because more people become aware of the need for it. My counterpoint to this is the visible face of translators becomes these non-professionals. So you look and, for instance, we have the top translators over here. They have pseudonyms. You're not really, some of them do have their real names underneath. Some of them are just going by initials. It doesn't really give you a professional view of translators because you're looking sometimes at very cute usernames, you're looking at initials, you're not looking at having an actual professional profile associated with it. And in addition, if you do have a profile, you're not necessarily a professional translator. So the visible face that you're giving to translation is, well, anybody can do it. It's a very easy task because there's thousands of people here who have contributed. We think their translations are great and they don't have any training. So this is the problem that I see with this argument that it's going to increase the visibility for the profession. I think there's good visibility and bad visibility, and in some cases we're looking at bad visibility for the profession. Onto that question of whether there are professional translators participating in projects. I did do a study a number of years ago about Wikipedia translators. I surveyed 75 of them. I asked them about their formal training. 68% of them said they had no formal training. I had asked them whether they had a degree in translation, a certificate in translation, some courses in translation, some workplace training. There were some of them that did, but 68% of them said they had none of that as translators. These are the professions that they listed. The largest green one is student. The large green chunk over there is student. I had 6 high school students, 4 college university students, and 17 college or university students in fields other than languages. So the vast majority of them were young males, usually under 30, and as I said, about 80% of them I think were males as opposed to females. But that's something that's particular within Wikipedia. Even the editors are usually male and they're usually very young, so it's not surprising that the translators follow the same trend. But again, most of them were students. They did work in the IT sector. Very few of them worked in the language industry, but there were some translators who did have a degree in translation, a certificate in translation, some training. There were some people who also were ATA certified who were translating for Wikipedia as well. So as I said, you have to keep in mind that there are some professional translators, but they are often being mixed up in a large pool of non-professionals who are participating in the project. And so onto that contentious issue of quality, I found this really fascinating study that was published just recently. He was comparing the peninsular Spanish version of Facebook with 25 social networks that were locally produced in Spain. He wanted to analyze the language of the social networks that were produced in Spanish in Spain versus the localized version of Facebook. And he was comparing things like the verb use, whether it was infinitive or imperative, some of the term choices, and he found that the Facebook version, it matched the terms and the verb tenses that were used in the websites that were naturally produced in Spanish. And interestingly, this was not the case when he did a similar study of localized websites a few years ago. He was looking at websites that had been localized into Spanish, and he compared them with websites that had been produced in Spanish. And he found that there were differences in terms. For instance, original Spanish sites preferred contacto for the contact button, whereas localized websites often had things like contactenos because they were influenced by the fact that it said contact us in English. But he didn't find these same differences when he was looking at the localized version of Facebook, even though Facebook hadn't been translated by professionals, or at least hadn't been generally translated by professionals because those professional translators were working in the background. This is the only study that I've seen that's actually compared or actually done a study of the quality of the translation. And this was only on the Spanish version of Facebook, and it was only with a few small aspects of the site. But I did think that the results were very interesting. I did find another study that was looking at, they did an experiment. So this wasn't actually a real translation, but what they did was they did an experiment where they used the Amazon's Mechanical Turk system. Has anybody ever used this, or is anybody familiar with it? This is a platform that allows you to break up tasks into very tiny micro tasks, what they call micro tasks. So it might involve labeling a picture, or translating a single sentence, or something that can be done in just a few seconds. And you're usually paid just a few cents to do these small micro tasks. So what they did was they used Amazon's Mechanical Turk platform, and they recruited translators. They offered 10 cents to translate a sentence from Urdu into English. Then they found some US-based participants in what they call Turkers, so people who are in the Mechanical Turk system. They asked them to edit those translated sentences. They paid them 25 cents per 10 sentences. So you now have these translations that were generated by possibly Urdu speakers, possibly English speakers that have been translated into English. They paid English speakers 25 cents to edit 10 sentences. And then they found US-based Turkers again. They were asked to rank the edited sentences at a rate of 6 cents per 4 translated sentences. What they found, their conclusions were that they did manage to get some high-quality translation, and it was much cheaper than professional translation because even though they had to pay a lot of users to translate the sentences so they could then rank them and do the editing, what they came out with at the end was something that was what they considered to be comparable to professional translation. I should mention, though, that they're not from translation studies. They're from computer science and computational linguistics. So the way that they evaluated the translations was based on the length of the source text and the target text sentences, the frequency of phrases in the translation compared to the same phrases in the Google Books Ngram database. So they weren't necessarily comparing transfer issues. So it's not, I don't know if this is the case that this is actually a reliable way of evaluating the quality of crowdsourcing, but their argument that they were trying to make was it is possible to use the system and get some quality results. I did a study of Wikipedia revision. It's still in the, it's been accepted, but I haven't finished the revisions yet, so it's not published yet. I looked at translated articles. I was looking at translations from French and Spanish into English. I looked at 29 translations. 26 of them had at least one language and one transfer problem shortly after they were posted. I looked for up to 2 years to see whether the revisions had been made to get rid of those language and transfer problems, and up to 2 years later, half of those errors were still there. So this is, again, there are different kinds of platforms. We're looking at Facebook in one case, which is very different from Wikipedia, but it is the case that not all crowdsourcing initiatives are created equally. It's possible that some of them will result in higher quality than others, but there were some problems with Wikipedia. Although I was surprised, I did find some instances where the transfer errors and language problems were completely ironed out shortly after, or within 6 or 7 months, where another user went in and corrected all of the problems that I had been able to identify. So it was the case that sometimes some people did go in and fix the problems, and in other cases, articles just sat there with these errors for a very long time. What often happened too was that language errors could be picked up fairly easily, but the problems of terminology would stay around for quite a bit longer, because even if you're a bilingual speaker, you would have to go back and meticulously compare it with the source text to be able to find out that there was an error in the first place. It's very easy to find grammar errors and spelling errors. It's a lot less easy to go back and compare and find a problem with a term. Yeah?
The problem I see with this is that these kinds of sites that you're talking about that are being translated, it seems to me there's quite low risk in making a mistake in these translations. But if you're doing legal, if you're doing medical, if you're doing financial, there's a very high risk to making a mistake. And what company, what really bona fide company is going to trust a crowdsourcing translation when millions and millions of dollars for them are on the line?
I think that's a good point to raise. The texts that are chosen for crowdsourcing projects are often chosen very judiciously on that basis. You won't find crowdsourced projects for legal texts. You won't find them for medical texts and things like that do have more liability issues, and that also wouldn't interest users. You have to find texts that are going to be interesting enough to users that they're going to want to translate them. And so you're right, these are sort of low-risk texts as opposed to the higher-risk texts. And that's one of the points that comes up sometimes when people talk about crowdsourcing. They say, what's going to happen here is that professional translators are always going to be used to translate the legal text. They're going to be used to translate the medical text. They're going to, whereas some of these other things like the social networking websites, they might be used with the crowdsourcing model. And so instead of just saying it's ruining the possibilities of professional translation, it might just turn into two streams where professionals are doing the texts that are higher risk and require more specialized training, and the non-professionals or the professionals plus non-professionals are participating in the other kinds of projects. Yeah.
That's true, that's good that it'll have two streams, but it reinforces in the general public that language is something that anybody can do, and it keeps reinforcing that. And I think that's where the real harm is, because the general public keeps thinking that anybody can learn a language, you have another language, the minute you know another language, you can transfer from one to the other. And it does. There's a lot of people that don't understand special language that you need a more qualified person, and it takes a lot of intellectual effort. And I think that's where the real harm is that it keeps reinforcing this idea that anybody can do the work. And it's not something that you get in other professions. Nobody would think that a doctor can just automatically become a doctor. An engineer can, but we still have this idea that anybody can transfer language from one to the other. This idea of it being a profession gets eroded, and that's where I find it really does the most harm.
Yeah, it's a good point. And actually, I wanted to point out that crowdsourcing is used with other types of tasks as well. One place that it's been used extensively is photography as well. You'll find iStock Photos, for instance, allows the general public to upload their photos. People can now pay 3 or 4 cents or a couple dollars for a photo, whereas before they might have had to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for a professional photographer. And the same idea applies. If we have enough people who upload their photos, some of it's going to be garbage, but some of it will be gold, even though these are not professionals. The book that Jeff Howe coined the term crowdsourcing in, I think it was 2006. When he published his book, he had tons and tons of examples from different fields. He didn't even mention translation. Translation didn't even get mentioned in the book, but it was something that was happening with increasing frequency. He was looking at t-shirt design, the photography. He was looking even at Procter & Gamble, trying to crowdsource ideas for different products. When they were encountering problems, coming up with the answers to these kinds of problems in their own company, they would put out a call, sort of a contest to the general public and see what kind of answers they could come up with. So it is affecting other professions as well. Yeah.
Short question. You say that legal and medical texts are not translated in that way online, but in Wikipedia, I know that it's not the right source for citation when you are in an academic setting. Encyclopedias are not allowed to be cited. But in Wikipedia, you have articles, medical, and sometimes maybe legal. I have seen medical, that certain people have translated, but you don't know if they are really a doctor or a professor who has done it, but you have no idea. In Wikipedia, what do you think about that?
Although, of course, with Wikipedia, you don't know if it was a doctor who wrote the article in the first place. Again, it was open to anybody. So I think in that case, because Wikipedia does have that credibility problem, even the translation is going to have the credibility problem. So even though you're right, the translators might not have any medical training or any experience translating medical texts, we don't know who wrote the medical article in the first place. But it is a good example to bring up because there is a medical translation initiative at Wikipedia with the goal of translating medical articles from English into other languages to help disseminate medical knowledge. And so you're right, maybe that's problematic because we don't have people who have particular credentials translating the articles. But you could, on the other hand, argue that we don't know who wrote the articles in the first place, so maybe they were of unreliable quality in the first place. Yeah?
Do you have any statistics on how much of the crowdsourced translation that's done is from English as opposed to into English? And for example, with Wikipedia, it sounds like they are translating from other languages into English. But what percentage of the Wikipedia articles are written in languages other than English?
Definitely English is the largest encyclopedia. The 3 largest are English, German, and French, with the other encyclopedias having a much smaller number of articles. Those are the top 3 that have over 1 million articles. So translation does generally happen from English into other languages, but with Wikipedia, because there is so much content written in other languages, you can find it going in the other direction as well. You're right though, with projects like Facebook and Twitter and Hootsuite and a lot of those other social networking sites, the translation is usually from English out into other languages.
No, I was just going to say, I think you pretty much pointed it out anyway, but I think it really is important to distinguish between, first of all, between non-for-profit initiatives like Wikipedia or TED. So, I personally don't have any problem with that idea that volunteers, there's a mission, there. It's just like, any other voluntary organization where professionals can get involved. I don't have a problem with that idea. And certainly, of course, it does also have the side effect of a lot of, as in the case of Wikipedia, the quality suffers. Naturally, you expect that and accept that. With for-profit sites like Facebook and Twitter, I think what's really important to highlight is the kind of text that you're translating crap. I'm sorry, I said it's, I mean, they're text-wise, it's a sort of translation job that if you were offered it, you say, oh God, I don't want this one. Give me something interesting. And so really, I don't think it's a threat to translators that, all people who are involved in the site who want, it's a hobby site. They want to participate in that way. That's fine. But it's not, as you say, it's not going to affect. No one's going to crowdsource a legal translation. No one's going to crowdsource a translation of an academic article. No one's going to crowdsource a translation of Don Quixote. So there's really no professional translators. The kind of work that we do. There's any threat.
Okay, I've been told I have time for one more question. Are you going to leave it?
Have you found any crowdsourcing within a company? Because that's something that I have heard. I haven't seen any examples where a company would ask their own employees to crowdsource things, so their logic being that the people have the expertise, they just happen to have another language, and they try to pull from within a company and get the company to get their employees to crowdsource.
I have heard of initiatives where there is more of a barrier than in something like Twitter, where you open it up to all your users, but I don't know of any off the top of my head. It's not one that I've looked into, but it could be something that's happening. As I say, I really can't say too much on it. Sorry? I don't know too much about that one.